Hi everyone, my name is Francis. I am from Brazil. I was born and raised in Rio, but I have been living abroad for a while now. And while living abroad, I've come across so many misconceptions that people have about Brazil or about Brazilian people in general, some of which are true, but the vast majority of these misconceptions are not actually based on facts. Since I moved to Europe, I noticed that there is a lot of questioning on the appearance of Brazilians, which is something that I wasn't really familiar with before. So I decided to make this video to kind of, clarify some of the common misconceptions that people have, and also, maybe you will know a little bit more about me and about my culture by the end of this video. So there is a lot of confusion and different perceptions on the way that Brazilians are supposed to look like. I cannot count the amount of times that I have been asked, like, why do you look this way, or why are you so light, or why are you so dark, or usually this questioning of course comes from people who are not familiar with Brazil, who don't really know the culture, who don't really know the country. So for those who are not familiar, Brazil is not only the biggest country in South America, but it's also the biggest country in Latin America. It is the 5th largest country in the world and also the 6th most populated country in the world with over 200 million people. So it's safe to say that in a country that is so big and that has so many people, not everybody will look the exact same way. Well, to understand what people in Brazil actually look like, we have to understand a little bit about the history of the country. But don't worry, I'm not gonna bore you with the entire history of the country because we don't have the entire day over here. I'll just simplify it so you can understand how the population of Brazil developed, so you can understand what ethnicities made Brazil what it is today. And if you're curious to know about different aspects of the culture, you can also just let me know in the comments, because if I see that there is enough interest on the topic, I could make an entire video dedicated to that. So this area that we now call Brazil was inhabited by thousands of years by a large number of indigenous populations from multiple ethnicities who developed their own communities and cultures. It is estimated that there were about 7 million indigenous people already living there until the arrival of the Portuguese in the 1500s, just 8 years after Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas. And we all know by now that the Americas are already discovered a long time ago before the Europeans arrived, but that's a topic for another video. So during those first years of colonization, the area that would later develop into what we know now as Brazil was inhabited mostly by the Europeans and the indigenous populations that were already living there before. There were obviously lots of wars between the native populations and the European colonizers, but there were also a lot of disputes between the French, the Spanish, and the Portuguese on who was going to take over the land. The Spanish ended up taking the rest of South America and creating countries like Argentina, Peru, Bolivia, and so on. The French ended up with a little piece of land close to the Amazon called the Guianas, and the Portuguese retained the biggest piece of land in the continent that we now know as Brazil. By the mid-16th century, the Portuguese started a process of plantation to take resources of the region and export it back to Europe. At first, the Portuguese used enslaved labor by the native populations, and consequently they started a long process of human traffic and slavery from African countries. It's obviously very difficult to pinpoint from which countries exactly this African population was coming from, but it's estimated that it was coming from the former Portuguese colonies such as Angola and Mozambique. During the 1600s, they started developing the land, and there was an economic boom that people like to call it the Brazilian Golden Rush. And that attracted many more immigrants from Europe and from the former Portuguese colonies in search of opportunity. During that time, there was a huge influx of Dutch who settled mostly in the northeast of Brazil, but consequently immigrants from other parts of Europe became more and more interested in the region as well. And most of the people who were consequently coming to the land were coming from Portugal, Spain, Italy, Germany, Japan, Switzerland, Syria, China, South Korea, Poland, Ukraine, France, Lebanon, Israel, Russia, Bolivia, and Paraguay. And in Brazil, with all of these different populations coming in to build the country, there was a much more sense of unity and identity. It never officially went through a process of apartheid or segregation like countries like the United States or South Africa went through. So for hundreds of years, this population of different ethnicities in different parts of the world had a much higher chance to mix amongst each other. It's even interesting to me as a Brazilian how many countries in the world at this moment, because of globalization, are starting to deal with the fact that there are many more couples of different ethnicities getting together, and people are mixing much more all over the world. And it's interesting because for us, this has been our history already for hundreds of years. That's why a few years ago, a lot of articles came out saying that in the future, everybody will look like Brazilians because yeah, we are just like this very diverse group of people. And this, by the way, a history that us Brazilians share with all of our Latin American neighbors. So Mexico, Colombia, Costa Rica, all Latin American countries share a very similar history in that aspect, of course with its own regional differences. Okay, Francis, we got the history, but what about now? What do Brazilians actually look like? So as you know by now, Brazil is a huge and diverse country made from immigrants from all over the world. So it's literally impossible to say that Brazilians look just like one specific way. If you would think like that and say, okay, what is a real Brazilian supposed to look like? Then you would have to say that it's the native population, but unfortunately they represent only 1%, well actually less than 1% of the population of the country. All of the rest of the population of the indigenous people were either exterminated by the Europeans or they mixed together with the rest of the population of Brazil. But there are still some regions in the country, usually close to the forests or in some very remote areas, where you can also have direct contact with the native population. So now let's see some statistics to see what the ethnic makeup of Brazil looks like nowadays. Brazil has the largest population of Lebanese descent in the world, even more than in Lebanon itself. We have the largest population of Japanese descent in the world outside of Japan. Brazil has a bigger population of African descent than Nigeria. Brazil is in the top 10 largest Jewish population in the world. Brazil has the largest population of Syrian descent in the world, the fourth largest population of Italian descent in the world, and I could go on and on and on here for hours, but you get the point. Even though in total Brazil is a very mixed and very diverse country, there are certain regions with a much bigger cultural heritage from certain ethnic groups. In the north of Brazil and in some parts of the center-west, in the states of Amazonas, Mato Grosso and Mato Grosso do Sul, there is a bigger percentage of the population with native heritage. So there is a lot of indigenous cultural heritage in some parts of those regions. And you can see that usually in the food and the folklore, for example. The state of Bahia in the northeast of Brazil is the state with the biggest number of people with African heritage. So you can see that heritage in the way that people look, the way they dress, the music scene, the religion they practice, and that's also the area where the famous martial arts called capoeira was invented. In the states of the south of Brazil, on the other hand, there is a big number of people of German, Polish, Russian and Ukrainian heritage. And you can see that influence in the architecture, the food, the people, and that's also where you can find the biggest Oktoberfest in the world outside of Munich. So yeah, the Oktoberfest in Brazil is actually bigger than in the most of Germany apart from Munich. What I also found very curious is that some people here in Europe think that in Brazil, the Brazilians who have German ancestry, they have so because of the World War. So there were a lot of Germans who were refugees from the war and who escaped to Brazil and Argentina and some other countries in South America. But actually the German population has been immigrating to Brazil already since hundreds of years ago. So a lot of Brazilians are mixed with Germans as well, and it's not because of the World War II, it's simply because this has been happening for a long time. And if you go to the state of São Paulo, this is where most Brazilians with a Japanese heritage live. You see a big influence of Japan in the culture, the foods and the festivities, and also of course on the way that people look. I remember once I saw this video on YouTube. It was from an American YouTube channel, and they had a Brazilian model who was redhead, and oh my god, like the comments in that video were insane. Like people were going on fights and arguments saying that she is not Brazilian and like she was fake Brazilian or something like that, because I think people don't realize that there is actually gingers in Brazil as well. And it's funny because all of those comments of people like fighting and having these arguments were from people who have actually never been to Brazil, were like all foreigners. And the Brazilians in the comments were just saying like, hey, but that's not true. Like here we are a very diverse country. We have people from all different ethnicities. We are very proud of the fact that our country is very diverse and that you have people from all sorts of colors and sizes and ethnicities everywhere you go. So yeah, it is really impossible to say that Brazilians have just one specific look when we are so diverse. And I'm also really curious to know what is it like in your country. Do you also have a similar history? Is it also very diverse, or is it more homogeneous? Do you have different ethnic groups living there? I would be really curious to know, so let me know in the comments. So subscribe to my channel if you haven't subscribed yet, and I see you guys next week with a new video. Bye!